So, welcome to the fourth Sunday in Lent as we continue on our sacred journey through these days of Lent on our path toward resurrection. The hope of resurrection is just around the corner. We can feel it. Perhaps you've already decorated your home with pastel colors and the bunnies and flowers of spring, but we still have a little ways to go before we enter that garden with the empty tomb. For now, we continue to wander in the wilderness. All of this wilderness wandering of Lent seems to be part of the process of embracing transformation and helps us to see new possibilities. The scripture reading for today from Joshua finds the Israelites at the end of their 40 long years of wandering on the brink of something very new. Moses had led the Hebrews to the brink of the promised land, but as God had said, Moses would see the land, but would not enter it. Moses was not able to lead God's people any further. So with the promised land just on the other side of the Jordan, God tapped Joshua to be the leader that would move God's people into the land that God had promised them. God was with Joshua, just as God had been with Moses, and God promised Joshua, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them." They'd been wandering and they'd been waiting, and now they stood on the brink of the promise. Everything they had been dreaming for was just across the Jordan. Joshua prepared the people to cross the river just as God had asked him to. Just as Moses had led the people out of Egypt and God delivered the people by parting the Red Sea, in chapter 3 of Joshua, we read the story of how Joshua led the people straight through the middle of the Jordan River, even with its seasonal state of being way over the banks of the river. As the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant came to the edge of the Jordan, their feet touching the water, it stopped. It stopped flowing and it stood still, and it rose into a big heap down the way from them, and the water was cut off, allowing the people to cross safely right through the middle of the river. Joshua commanded one man from each of the 12 tribes to pick up a stone from the middle of the Jordan. And then when they all got safely to the other side, they stacked these 12 stones to serve as a reminder of how God had parted the water once again, this time so that they could cross safely into the promised land. This is such a dramatic story, and it has so many parallels to the Exodus, which helped the Israelites, and it also helps us to kind of connect those dots and to remember God's deliverance as they stand in the very land they had been promised. This is where we find our passage from today. Joshua and the Israelites are in the promised land celebrating the Passover. As God had commanded, Passover was celebrated on the first anniversary of that night when the firstborn of the Hebrews were spared from that final deadly plague which God used to deliver them from bondage in Egypt. After fleeing Egypt, the first anniversary of the Passover was observed, but then it was not observed again until right here, 39 years later, in Gilgal. That's when they remembered the deliverance and the fulfillment of the promises, and they celebrated the first Passover in the promised land. As they stood in the new land after 40 years of wandering, they remembered all that God had done to deliver them from slavery and to fulfill the promises made to the patriarchs of the past, Abraham, Jacob, and Moses. Can you even imagine the excitement of the Israelites? I think it might have sounded something like that. The excitement of the Israelites as they stood in the promised land after all that they had been through. I mean, have you ever experienced waiting for something so very long and then it finally arrives and it's hard to believe? I knew it was coming. I knew that God would deliver, but now, wow, it is here. And I can hardly believe it. Somebody pinch me. The wandering was over. While they had been wandering, they had been surviving on manna, a mysterious white substance that came from heaven. Now, 40 years is a very long time to eat the same thing. Sometimes I get on a kick at home when I find a recipe that is both easy to make and both girls like it, because that's not always an easy thing to find. So when I find something that's easy to make and that everybody likes, I can kind of get a little carried away with it and think, this is great. This is what we are going to eat now. But then after I've made it a few times, I kind of get a little overzealous, and then people get a little bored of this. And all of a sudden, what they thought was good and delicious now feels more like, oh, not again. I cannot even imagine serving the same thing for 40 years. But this is what had happened. They had eaten the same thing for 40 years. The Israelites did complain a little bit about eating the same thing, about this monotonous food that they had been eating, but that complaining didn't turn out so well. God reminded them to be thankful for what God had provided, and the response that God gave them made manna seem pretty good. And so I was thinking that maybe I needed to keep that Bible verse, that Bible passage handy. And so maybe the next time I hear groaning when I make dinner, we could pull that out as a little nightly devotion to remember to be thankful for the food that is provided for us. So they had eaten this manna every day for 40 years. But now the Israelites were in the land of Canaan, and they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. Wow, that is a change in menu. I wonder if they secretly kind of breathed a sigh of relief. Thank goodness, I was so sick and tired of eating the same thing. I wonder if some of them kind of missed it, though, and started to kind of remember it fondly. And maybe others kind of worried about what the future would hold for them when they had depended on this every day from God's provision daily. I wonder if they worried a little bit about what was to come. I think that this passage today, at this pivotal juncture in the life of the Israelite people, should cause us to ponder the question that I would guess would have been on the minds of the people that were gathered at Gilgal. What sustains us? What will sustain us when what had for so long is gone? The menu was now very different. There was variety as they tasted the delights of the new local cuisine. But the message of the food, whether manna from heaven or the product of the land of Canaan, is the same. The sustenance they need is more than simply fuel for their bodies. Manna, this miraculous food from heaven, had sustained them in the wilderness. There was always just the right amount of this heavenly bread, exactly one portion for each person. It did no good to try to take more than one's share. No one could stockpile. Manna was only good for one day, except for on Fridays when God provided a double portion that could be saved and eaten on the Sabbath. For 40 years in the wilderness, God had faithfully provided manna every day. God's presence is so visible and tangible for the wandering Israelites. A pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire to guide them, and manna to eat. For 40 years, the Israelites learned to trust in God's provision in very immediate and physical ways. And then at Gilgal, the wandering that had prepared them to inhabit the land was over. They entered the new land, and manna ceased to be provided. And wow, in its place are all of the produce and the delicious delights of the new land, a land of milk and honey. What a delicious fulfillment of God's promise. Despite the fact that the Israelites had not always been good, God had always been good to them. They wandered for years utterly dependent upon God. And now the land of promise lied before them, a land of great opportunity. And yet, how easily our blessings can become our distractions, our temptations to forget about God's sustaining presence. Joshua was aware of the dangers of these new opportunities. As he looked around at the land that they had come to possess, he understood the danger that God's people faced in this new land of plenty. The abuse and shame and disgrace of slavery in Egypt was left behind them in the distant history, but new temptations and distractions lied before them. Don't these new issues of the Israelites sound like some of our own first world issues? Distractions seem to keep us from appreciating God's presence much more than an intentional turning away from God. Despite our past failings to be faithful, despite the messes that we can get ourselves into, God forgives and provides us with new opportunities to serve and to be faithful. The future is bright and full of promise before us, and yet, like that of the first generation of Israelites in the promised land, distractions threatened to shift the focus from God. During Lent, as we reflect on our relationship with God, Joshua and the first Passover in Canaan gives us a lens through which it is good to ponder our own journey. For these younger, wandering Israelites who were now entering the promised land that had been promised to their parents, the Exodus is important. It's a vital part of their identity, but it has always been history to them. The parents experienced that first Passover, but most of them had died in the wilderness. Both generations know God's presence and God's promise, deliverance and sustenance in tangible ways. These young Israelites knew God, but not from the night of Passover. They knew God as the God of the wilderness, the God of manna. Of course, they were excited. The fulfillment of God's promise was right there, right in front of them. The land looked so good, but it was not empty. It contained great riches, temptations, and resistance. As they enter the land of plenty, Joshua knew that they must remember their covenant with God. As we stand on the cusp of Easter, I wonder if this is what God is calling us to consider too. As Americans, we live in a land of promise. We all too often take for granted the financial security and opportunities that much of the rest of the world cannot even begin to fathom. And yet wealth can be both a blessing and a temptation. It is a blessing to live in a land flowing with milk and honey, but it is also easy to rely more on the land than on the source of the blessing. It begs the question, what is it that sustains us? Our success and security can lull us. It can lure us into celebrating ourselves rather than the one who provides the blessing, the one who is calling us to seek our treasures first in heaven rather than on earth. Like the Israelites, as they entered the promised land, we must renew and remember our covenant with God, who leads us into new and challenging futures. The land still has milk and honey, and yet we know that we cannot live on milk and honey and bread alone. We must rely on and trust in the source of all blessing. Like Joshua's Israelites, we too must confess that we are often not the people that we should be. God is still leading God's people out of disgraceful wandering situations into genuine divine blessings. Our challenge as inhabitants of this land of promise is to pray, to meditate on the Lord, to confess our sin, and to continue to turn to God's loving, merciful embrace. On our Lenten journey, we are also headed towards a Passover meal. A first Passover meal of sorts for our understanding of Jesus and new life and grace. In just a few weeks, on Maundy Thursday, we will partake in communion as we remember the night in which Jesus was betrayed. That night, Jesus took the familiar observation of the Passover meal and did something new. Instead of manna, Jesus became for us the bread of heaven, the bread of life, the embodiment of covenant promise. On our Lenten journey, we are on the brink of something very new. In a few short weeks, we will remember Jesus dying on the cross, being buried, and raising again from the dead for our sake. Jesus was sharing the Passover meal with his friends, continuing that tradition that Joshua celebrated with his people as they first crossed the Jordan and entered into the promised land, the story of deliverance and steadfast love. When we celebrate Holy Communion, we partake in the bread of life God provides to liberate us from our sin. We celebrate and we receive the bread of heaven, God's sustenance, God's covenant promise made for our sake through our Savior, Jesus Christ. Let us not forget the wandering journey that has led us to here. The wandering journey in which we learn to more faithfully place our trust in God, whom we know will provide for our good. As we face the question, what sustains us? Let us not hesitate to answer the question, only our loving and merciful God.